Okay, Y10, I'm just going to talk you through planning an answer to the social responsibility question that you've got for your homework. So what I would do, first of all, is I would take the main word or phrase out of the question, and in this instance it is social responsibility. So I would write that down on a piece of paper. I would spend about 10 minutes doing a plan for the question, which is what I'm going to do with you now. And I would think, first of all, for an introduction, what does social responsibility mean? So that was what I'm going to put in my introduction. So what is social responsibility? And for that, I'm just responsibility. There we go. For that, all I'm going to do first of all is I would look at my knowledge organiser and I would literally lift what it says in the knowledge organiser, and I will write that as a phrase in my introduction. So I'd explain what social responsibility is, but really more importantly, we need to understand why Priestley was so interested in social responsibility. What was it that made him so passionate about it? So also in my introduction, I'm going to link to why the writer was interested. Priestley was interested in this because, and again I would look at my knowledge organiser, and for that bit you're going to need to look at the context bit of your knowledge organiser. So I would look at the fact that it was written in 1945 after World War II, and as a socialist himself, Priestley really wanted to criticise the problems of an individualistic capitalist ideology, which it says on your knowledge organiser. So I borrow those phrases, and I would think about how he wanted to use this play as a warning, really, so we return back to those sort of times where the individualistic capitalist ideology was a problem, where people like Mr. Berling were prevalent in society, were dominated society. So I'd sort of look at my context bit of my knowledge organiser and I would put that bit in there. So I'll talk about the fact that it was written in 1945, that Priestley himself was a socialist, and that he really wanted to, and that's all about social responsibility. I have to pause on that every single time, don't I? And also I would say about the problems of an individualistic capitalist ideology, and that's all on your knowledge organiser, so look there. I would also mention in a brief introduction how the Berlings come into this, so the Berling family and what they represent. And they represent everything that Priestley saw was a problem in society at the time, and that was their individualistic capitalist ideology. That just means that they were out for themselves, they were quite selfish. I'm going to put that word down because that's an important word to use. They were selfish, they were only invested in themselves, and they didn't really think about themselves, think about others outside of their little bubble, and that's really evident through some of the characters. So that's our introduction. We're only going to write about these things very briefly, but I'm really just going to lift things from the knowledge organiser, nice key phrases, but I will refer back to the term social responsibility. The next thing I need to think about is which characters am I going to write about in terms of social responsibility. I'm not going to write about all of them because in the exam I'd only have 45 minutes to write, including 10 minutes to plan, so really only 30 minutes writing time, and 5 minutes checking and improving at the end. So really I'm only going to talk about two main characters, and I think the best character that I would like to talk about for this, I would like to write a paragraph about Mr. Berling, because he is the first character we meet who really shows a lack of social responsibility, a lack of caring for other people. So if the inspector is the voice of J.B. Priestley, then Mr. Burling is completely the antithesis, is completely the opposite. So I'm going to talk about him because he is the antithesis of Priestley's views that we should care about each other. He's a very selfish man and really just believes in looking after himself and his own business and all of that and all of those quotations. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of the quotation explosions that we've done before, and I'll just put those together in a paragraph. So I'll look at Mr. Burling at the beginning of the play. So I'll have a quotation that I'm going to explode from that, and that will be probably from when he's talking about the way some of these cranks talk, and right now you'd think everybody has to look after everybody else as if we're all mixed together like bees in a hive community and all that nonsense. I might just have a section of that quotation and not the full quote, but I'm going to talk about how he talks about cranks, community and all that nonsense. And the reason I'm going to talk about this is because this really shows a lack of social responsibility. So that's the first quotation I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do that in just in the same way that I would do if I were doing a quotation explosion in lessons. So I'll do my statement, my evidence, my inference, my zoom, and my exploration will be linked to context. And so I might, because I'm talking about context within this quotation, I'll link that to Priestley's beliefs as opposed to Mr. Burling's beliefs here. So I'll link that to socialism perhaps. Again, all in your knowledge organiser. Then I think I need to show what Mr. Burling has done to Eva Smith. So I will look at another quotation about Mr. Burling, and I might even talk about the sharp ring of the doorbell first of all, for that to be silenced. But then I might talk about how he talks about Eva Smith, so a quotation about that. And the quotation on your knowledge organiser that's good for that is quotation number 5, and that is if you don't come down sharply on these people, I think, or is it these people? They'd soon be asking for the others, something like that. And you've exploded that quotation before as well, so that's a good one to talk about, how his attitude towards other people and how he lacks social responsibility because he doesn't really think about others and his workers and the working class people that work for him. He wants to keep all that money for himself. And then also I'm going to talk about another quotation about Mr. Burling, is how he, whether he takes responsibility or not, and he doesn't take any responsibility. And he says, for quotation number 8 on your knowledge organiser, he says, I was quite justified. And he really doesn't change. He really doesn't change his view in spite of the fact that he finds out about Eva Smith's death. So we can talk about a lack of social responsibility for Mr. Burling. So they're the 3 quotations I'm going to talk about for Mr. Burling. But because this is a theme question, I'm going to talk about more than one character. And I think Sheila is a really good character to contrast with Mr. Burling. And the reason that Sheila is such a good character to choose is because, remember, the younger generation, Sheila and Eric, they change, whereas the older generation, Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling, don't change. So if ever you have a theme question, always try and choose a character from the different generations to show the contrast. So I do much the same for Sheila, so I talk about really what she represents, and that's also on your knowledge organiser. And then I will talk about what she's like at the beginning and how she reacts to Eva Smith's death, and how her lack of social responsibility, I think, really stems from the fact that her lack of responsibility as a woman at the time. So women at the time, they didn't really have any responsibility well, she wouldn't have done because she didn't have a family. She wouldn't have had to go to work, a middle class woman. So her lack of responsibility, a social responsibility for her, comes from ignorance. And we see that when she reacts straight away to hearing about the death, and she says, was she young, was she pretty? And you can talk about that quotation and the explosion that you've already done for that. She does, however, so that's quotation number 9 that I would look at. She also does, however, say about when she responds to her father, and she says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So that might be an interesting quote to talk about. And she definitely does take social responsibility, because she says, sorry, that was quotation 10. She does take responsibility because she says, I'll never do it again. And at the end of the play, when all the other characters don't seem to have taken any responsibility and don't seem to have changed their ways at all, she is the one that says, it frightens me the way that you talk. So all of those quotations really show that she does take more responsibility. Now, it's not enough just to mention those quotations. You must make sure that you go into detail and explore them, just the same way we have done in lesson. As a conclusion, I'm going to plan. Oh, I've run out of paper. I'm going to put my conclusion on the back. As a conclusion, I think it's always nice to end with the end. And the character that most wants to show social responsibility in this play is the inspector, because remember, he is the voice of J.B. Priestley. And so what I would always do for a conclusion is I would refer to, oh, my screen keeps going very blurry. I would refer to, let's see if I can get that to zoom in properly. Nope. At the end, for a conclusion, I would always refer to the speech that the inspector gives just before he leaves, where he says, oh, we don't live alone, we're members of one body, and talks about the millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. So I think that's a really good way to end the essay, because that is the main message of the play, that there are still millions and millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths still left with us. You've exploded that quotation already this week, and you can use that as a conclusion to show that Priestley is suggesting that there are so many people that need help. There are because Eva Smith represents the working class women of the time, and we can't be complacent and think that the world is just going to change. Everybody needs to take part and be socially responsible for each other. Remember that J.B. Priestley helped to set up the welfare state, and perhaps you could mention that at some point in your answer as well, because that really shows his message in that we really must help others. So end with the end with the inspector's view, and your summary is that the young people, the younger generation, do take social responsibility, whereas the older generation do not. They are traditionalists and are stuck in their ways. So our plan will go something like this. Just to recap, we will have an introduction where we say what social responsibility is, use your knowledge organiser, talk about why Priestley was interested in this, talk about the context of the play, the fact that he was a socialist and believed in social responsibility. He helped set up the welfare state, and also briefly summarise how the Burling family didn't take any social responsibility at the beginning of the play. They were individualistic capitalist ideology. Then I would do 2 main paragraphs, one that explores Mr. Burling and his attitude throughout the play, constantly linking it to the term social responsibility. He doesn't take any responsibility. He believes that socialists are cranks. Talk about those quotations. I would then talk about Sheila and how she is the opposite. Actually, initially she lacks social responsibility, but some of this is just due to her ignorance, because of the way she's been brought up in the family, and she soon changes, and Priestley is showing that we have some hope that young people can change things in society. And then I would end my conclusion with talking about that, how the younger generation do change and the older generation do not, and I would end it by talking about the inspector's final speech about the Eva Smith, millions and millions of Eva Smiths still left with us. Now, you do not have to use all the quotations that I have just mentioned. This is just a guide for how I would plan my answer. I said I would spend about 10 minutes on this, and I've been speaking to you for 15, but haven't spoken much to many people for a while, so it's quite nice to talk to somebody. Anyway, have a go at planning it, and if you have any questions, just ask your English teacher, but do heavily rely on the knowledge organiser. You are more than well, we're hoping that you'll copy some things from the knowledge organiser, because then your phrasing will sound more academic, but you don't just have to stick with what I have suggested. You can do other things as well. Anyway, best of luck. Thank you very much. Good night.